Hello everyone, welcome to SAW Dialogues 2022, presented by Art and Market in partnership with National Arts Council Singapore. My name is Wong Sok Ting and I'm Content Manager at Art and Market. Welcome to the playback of the performance lecture by Salty Xi Jie Ng. We're glad to have you with us. I would like to introduce the performance lecture titled Dear Singapore Art Museum Acquisition Committee, co-presented by Singapore Art Museum. In collaboration with Shayus Sharif, Salty Xi Jie Ng presents her ongoing research based on her interviews with Singapore Art Museum directors, curators, and fellow artists.
Hello everyone, greetings and welcome to the Singapore Art Museum. My name is Shabir Hussain Mustafa. I'm a curator here and I also oversee the residencies program. SAM Residencies is a museum-run program committed to supporting the development of innovative artistic and curatorial practices that respond to current global discourses. It is developed in line with SAM's vision of engaging local and international artistic communities across a wide range of disciplines. The program, as it will evolve in the coming years, will feature an array of residency types to support emerging and innovative practices, facilitate collaborations, and widen public understandings of art. For the art community, especially in Singapore, it serves as an incubator for new approaches to artistic and curatorial dialogue within and beyond the field of contemporary art. It offers a platform for artistic experimentation and encourages the exchange of ideas and opportunities for future collaboration, as well as network building. Today's performance lecture by Xi Jie, whose work plays with the aesthetics of social relations and structures, is a fantastic highlight in these efforts. Xi Jie was part of a pilot batch along with Chu Hao Pei and Johan Yamin, which launched in December 2020 at the height of the pandemic. A range of conversations emerged between the three artists. Some perspectives are presented in the Present Realms project outside. I also want to acknowledge my colleagues Kim Ong and Andrea Pham for their tireless work in establishing the residency program, and Yao An for really getting a lot of these things together. Since the pilot batch, we have opened up to the world. This year, we plan to host more than 15 artists, curators, educators, and art organizations or collectives as part of SAM Residencies. Since December 2021, we have welcomed artists Sherry Sitaus and Aki Hassan, who are currently occupying both the artist studios outside. Last week, we had curator Moad Musbahi also join us. All three of them are around today, so if you want to say hi, just identify yourself. In November, we also welcomed Basah Open, a critical theory collective based right here in Singapore as our ex situ residents. Essentially, ex situ is a mode whereby we invite Asia-based art organizations to operate as a para-curatorial wing within the Singapore Art Museum. As a result, today's performance lecture is co-presented by Basah Open's Shayus Sharif. There will be Q&A also after the performance, so do stay back. And so, without any further delay, please join me in welcoming Xi Jie and Shah from the Singapore Art Museum Acquisition Subcommittee Advisory Task Force Coalition, or SAMASCATFC. Thank you.
Welcome and greetings from the Singapore Art Museum Acquisition Subcommittee Advisory Task Force Coalition. I am Xi Jie and this is my efficient team member, Shah. We are representatives of this coalition. Before we begin, we'd like to extend our deepest thanks to the Singapore Art Museum directors, curators, and acquisition committee members who turned up today at our invitation, as well as National Gallery Singapore and Asian Civilizations Museum curators and acquisition committee members. We honor your bravery in coming to listen to what artists have to say. Shah, courage medallions, please.
We honor you for your courage. We honor you for your courage. We honor you for your courage. We honor you.
And if you look around, you will see color-coded name tags on everyone. Those in red are acquisition committee members. Curators are in red. Acquisition committee members are in green. And those in black, you're just everyone else. FYI.
We honor you for your courage.
Let's just finish waiting for Shah to hand out the courage medallions.
Eugene, we truly honor you for your courage.
She's telling them, we honor your courage. And I would also like to highlight your lucky draw items for today so you can compare what you got or you did not get. Obviously, the most coveted one is a 1 hour portfolio review with Eugene Tan at his favorite boulangerie in the downtown arts district. There are also some horoscopes, PMC horoscopes, so I'll explain a bit more about what PMC means later on. Please enjoy your vouchers. And we also like to highlight our private collection. Yes, we have a very, very strong private collection. It is about to rival the national collection. As you can see, we have, it's all outside on the table, so feel free to look at it again later. We have a blouse from Li Mei Si, Sungai Road street vendor. She wore this on the very last night of Sungai Road Flea Market and she shed tears onto this blouse. It was subsequently donated by Post Museum to our collection as Post Museum had their Save Sungai Road project. We also have a used cotton bud used by participant Chong Boon Cheng for the 3rd session of the Singapore Art Museum's Community Engagement Project, Femininity and the Nanyang Style Critical Murals of Today. The curator's note says, to the Heritage Conservation Center, if earwax changes color over time, please paint over to preserve original shades of cream, yellow, and khaki. Do not hesitate to log original colors with Pantone Index. Also want to highlight Little Mermaid tambourine used by busker Leslie Toh to elicit attention of the National Artistic Freelancers Council, who were walking past his basking spot on Orchard Road. However, they did not notice him. He donated this after his 3rd failed basking audition attempt. Thank you very much, Leslie. And now, my efficient team member Shah will go over today's agenda.
Firstly, what are social forms of art? Secondly, artist advisory. Thirdly, we will be reviewing research findings of the question, what is the National Collection? Next, we will be going through the PMC acquires art. Then, recommended methods for collecting social forms of art. Next, case study 1. ELAs, there can be no touching here. Next, acquisition proposal. Zarina Muhammad's 9 questions as instructions to construct pragmatic prayers for peculiar habitats. Finally, the bonus ending.
All right, thank you. Let's get started. Our main research question was, how have social forms of art been defined, documented, framed, archived, collected, and valued in Singapore? And we zoomed in on the act of museum acquisition or collection in relation to social forms of art. Why? Because being collected means being validated by the museum as an institution, entering its esteemed halls, and being cemented as part of the national narrative. It confers social capital. It symbolizes power. And social forms of art is a domain with roots in questioning power and revealing context. It's a way of art making that lives beyond artist studios and the white cube, and it has a lot of relational power and potential. We deem this intersection of immense importance to today's conversations, decisions, and existential crisis on art making, artistic discourse, and cultural heritage. We hope you agree. You might ask, what constitutes social forms of art? I believe that the very debate around this is part of the domain. So what do these terms mean to you? How do they serve us? What are the definitions and valuations of this spectrum? Should they be ranked based on their depth of engagement? Some say socially engaged art can only be used for dialogical processes as coined by Grant Kester, while relational aesthetics comes from Nicolas Bourriard. We have art and social practice, collaborative art, participatory art, which some might say is merely participatory and not collaborative. And then, well, we have community art, or art de communauté, often seen as, well, the simple art of the People's Association variety. You know what I'm talking about, I'm sure. While contextual practice references the context-aware nature of social forms of art. So, which is your favorite? Let us vote. There is no basis needed for one term being your favorite over another. Simply vote. Raise your hand when I call out your preferred option. It's either yes or no. Shah, are we ready? Sorry, it's not yes or no. Sorry, to go through the terms. Okay, socially engaged art. Raise your hand. Okay. Relational aesthetics. Raise your hand. Art and social practice. Raise your hand. Hey, the rest better choose, left only. Collaborative art. Raise your hand. Oh, got some people vote 2 times. Okay. Participatory art, raise your hand. Okay. Community art. Passion art this, passion art that. Anybody? Okay, nobody. Contextual practice, raise your hand. Oh, okay. And the winner is... Oops. Contextual practice! Yay! Thank you for that temperature around from the room. Now you might ask, what are some examples of social forms of art? We have Alicia Neo's Between Earth and Sky, reflecting on caregiving. Post Museum's Bukit Brown Index, triggered by government plans to cut through Bukit Brown Cemetery. The Migrant Workers Community Museum, initiated by Alfian Saad, Vithya Subramaniam, and Zulkhairi Zulkifli, and Shaiful Risan's Eraser Tournament, a nostalgic participatory eraser game reflecting on international relations. Bonus question, what do these works have in common? Anybody? Anyone wants to venture a guess? What do these works have in common? Okay, too bad. I will tell you the answer. None of them are in the National Collection! Woo! Okay, now, artists, you might ask, why should I even bother being collected by the museum? So we are going to tell you. Your parents can proudly tell their friends to go to roots.sg to see your art. Your bio will look better. You can increase your artist fee, increase chances of winning Young Artist Award, and then down the line, increase your chances of winning Cultural Medallion. Hence, overall, you'll lessen your precarity and make your parents happy. So, how can you be collected? Not that easy, but maybe it's not that hard also. Develop relationships with curators, write into museums, later get emails from curators around. Make performance art or projects with plans for certain objects to be collectible relics, and then inform your favorite curator that you are about to put up this performance as a hint. Or just own self, validate own self and other artists and start your own collection like ours. So, now let me shed some light on the mystical process of acquisition here in Singapore. We have the SAM directors, Eugene and June, here at the moment, who set the collection strategy. They answer to the board of directors of SAM, and they work with curators, who then work with artists, and then the curators will propose works perhaps to the acquisition committee, mainly consisting of curators and private collectors. And then they will agree to collect particular works to enter the national collection. From there, it will be, you can access this national collection via the online repository at roots.sg. And then the physical works are kept at the Heritage Conservation Centre at Jurong Port Road. Unfortunately, or interestingly, this is all managed by the National Heritage Board. So when an object enters the national collection, it is no longer under the purview of SAM. The national collection also includes collections from other stat boards and organizations like Asian Civilization Museum, Peranakan Museum, National Museum, the National Archives, National Gallery, Indian Heritage Centre, Malay Heritage Centre, and so on. So there, I hope I have demystified this process for you. But what is the National Collection? June Yap, SAM Director of Curatorial and Collection, says, we can think of the National Collection's evolution under different directorships, under different levels of resources provided, and also via its relationship within a larger national collection. In that sense, its legacy will have to be contended with. And what we are doing now, essentially, is, in a way, is to add another chapter to the longer story of the collection. In the process of my research, I asked many questions which are on that wall outside, like whose national narrative are we serving? How can we collect social forms of art? And please view the questions outside afterwards. Right now, I'd like to quote Andrea Pham, a SAM curator who's not able to be here today. She wrote in this essay, Emergent Connections in an Interlocking Art System, that there is a sliding scale of emerging artists. For who you speak with will very much determine where along the scale they locate an artist. So if you are an artist here today, I ask you to consider now, where are you along this scale? How do you feel about that? Do you have anxiety thinking about this question? She also says, collecting is the museum's attempt to diligently and responsibly reflect the history of the region and the themes and trends that have impacted the lives and affected the trajectories of artists. Sliding scale, emerging artists. She notes that in the last 5 years since she joined SAM, the institution's collection strategy has been edited or tweaked at least 3 times. And she asks, how do collections, private or publicly funded, function in our society today, and what is the agency of artists and private and public collections and institutions? So, what should a national collection contain? What are the possibilities of relationships between artists and acquisition committee members, or even with curators and museum directors? Let us take a look at roots.sg, the online repository of the National Collection. Teng Yan Hui, curator at SAM, who works with collections, says, the Heritage Conservation Centre is the custodian of the National Collection, for which SAM functions as a collecting agent. In the existing collections and management system, the taxonomy used is proposed by them with input from the collecting institutions. So if you look at the list of technique categories on the wall over here, you will see techniques that the National Collection is classified into, such as carving, metal working, painting, and there's also materials such as bamboo, metal, and wood. Kenji, another SAM curator, says, it matters a lot how we classify. Social practice demands we come up with new terminologies and to try to make those terms broadly relevant so they stick. So perhaps we can think about redefining some of these categories and adding and reinventing the taxonomy. What if we added relational process or dialogical process? Or perhaps even more specific, interview, conversation, dialogue, gathering, meal, walk, protest. J. Ko and Chu Chuyuan, socially engaged artists in Singapore, wrote in 2001, "We are arguing for dialogue to become an integral part of the aesthetic strategies of an artist. Not just as an additional activity to one's practice, it is important that dialogue precedes work or is initiated at the early stages of the work or perhaps even forms the main axis of the project." Now you might ask, what are some social forms of art in the Singapore Art Museum's collection? This is my pH 8.5 water, thank you. Here's what I was able to find, ranked in terms of the level of collaboration displayed. Although, mind you, I'm not saying that the higher the level of collaboration, the better the art. I have not included interactive installations. And of course, as you hear me go down this list, you might find yourself protesting inside as to whether some of these should be considered social forms of art. Rest assured, those are the correct emotions to be experiencing today. As I go through the list, I invite you to think about the level of agency of the participants and collaborators, the work's intended audience, and how those matter or not with each work. My apologies to the artists I'm citing for the very brief summary of their work that today's time allows. We have Wings by Alfredo and Isabel Aquilizan, who collected slippers originally worn by inmates through the Yellow Ribbon Project. Bloodline of Peace by Suzanne Victor with over 11,000 droplets of crowd-funded blood. Tapestry of Justice by Wong Hoi Cheong, 10,000 thumbprint contributions in support of the repeal of the Internal Security Act. Singapore Idols by Jing Kwek, featuring grass cutters. Payatas by Oscar Villamel, an installation made from dolls salvaged from a giant garbage heap in Manila. He was an outsider to the space and negotiated with locals who set up networks to locate these items. The Library of Unread Books by Heman Chong and Renee Stahl, where book donations were elicited. Single by Amanda Heng. I put that higher ranking than the books one because I think you can argue that providing an image of your naked buttocks constitutes higher participation than donating a book you have not read. Every Point of View by Matthew Nui, where representatives of particular demographics were invited to respond to questions about democracy. And perhaps talking about democracy in Singapore is harder than sharing a photo of your naked buttocks. And at the highest place of this list, we have Jurong West Street 81 by Shannon Castleman. She invited people to film each other and they all shared a meal at their void deck. So now that we've looked at this list, how do we collect social forms of art? Ting Yan Hui, curator, asks, how do we capture the participatory and ephemeral nature of such projects that perhaps resist transaction in the first place? What is a sensible way to begin collecting these kinds of things? Well, our coalition is here today to present some sensible proposals. These ideas were developed through conversations with artists and curators. Kenji, Han Xuemei, Ila, Kok Heng Luan, Li Xie, Zarina Muhammad, Alicia Neo, Eugene Tan, Ting Yan Hui, Shaiful Risan, Alfian Saad, NG Sia, Vithya Subramaniam, Woon Tian Wei, and Jun Yap. Thank you to those people for sharing their time and insights with me. Depending on where the intentions, desires, and resources of artists and museum intersect, the museum can acquire the collaborative artwork. That means like a collaborative video or sculpture made together by a group of participants or an individual piece of a collective whole. plus the narrative that comes with it, because when they reactivate the work, they are going to show this narrative again, or they might edit it and display it in a different way. For example, Alicia Neo's Between Earth and Sky, the museum might collect the video pieces with the umbrellas and set it up the very same way in future. The next method is to acquire a relic of the participatory or the collaborative process, plus the narrative that comes with it. To do so, we need to examine how value is ascribed and consider what part of the process we want to point to. Let's look at some examples of relics in the National Museum collection. We have Elizabeth Choi, our war heroines, internment clothes from 1943 in which she was tortured by the Japanese during World War II. We have her cheongsam, which she wore when she attended Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II's coronation in England in 1953. In these cases, the accompanying significant events lends value to the garments worn. But how about more commonplace objects? Consider the example of a 1970 calendar in the National Museum collection. It was issued by Fitzpatrick, an upper-class supermarket in Orchard Road, subsequently purchased by Cold Storage. It is indexed in the National Collection with a narrative that includes the nugget: the 1974 World Cup final was telecast for free on Sierra TV at the Fitzpatrick Supermarket car park in 1985. So, in the act of collection, this ordinary calendar acquires a sacred status in the national narrative, carrying with it a story that will likely be presented alongside it someday. You can bet that the conservators at the Heritage Conservation Center can be found at times bent over this dear yellowing calendar, trying to freeze time as they employ techniques to keep it pristine. Oh, the folly of humans. But anywho, in the case of social forms of art, can we then acquire a meaningful or interesting relic from the process or event that can carry the narrative of the work? This is an example from Shaifu Risan's Erasure Tournament, which I mentioned earlier. The museum could consider collecting a Singapore flag eraser from his collection dating back to the early 90s. How about something that might seem absurd on first glance, but could actually be deemed important to the national narrative? Would the National Museum Acquisition Committee, for example, agree to collecting this blouse on which tears were shed on the last night of Sungai Road Flea Market? So we might ask, when we collect, are we mythologizing relics to contribute to the national narrative? Whose national narrative? Would this be consented to be remembered in our national narrative? Who gets to say so? Moving on, another way of collecting social forms of art is to acquire a score for the reactivation of the work. Detailed instructions that an artist might furnish for curators, cultural producers, or artists to recreate the work. Although full recreation is not possible, you have to understand, you can only recreate the context. A little bit on scores. Felix Gonzalez Torres, an artist, creates collection certificates that cast owners as subcontractors and possibly even as virtual work-for-hire employees. SAM curator Kenji notes that Felix Gonzalez Torres has turned the instruction document itself into an art form. In Nobody Owns Me, an article in eFlux written by Joan Key, she writes, by delegating many of the functions ordinarily expected of artists, including sourcing materials and putting them together to create a tangible work, Gonzalez Torres shifted the role and perhaps the burden of the artist as service provider onto owners in the form of a unique and thus desirable experience. Now let me give you a local example of an instructional artwork. An artwork translated into creative instructions. Made Up sample, please note it is a made up, disclaimer. Let's Chat by Amanda Hing. Perhaps she could express this relational work in the form of a poem. I am going to recite this poem. On a Friday morning, purchase 1 kg bag of unprocessed taugeh from wet supermarket, not supermarket. Put bag of taugeh on a round marble table, 4 wooden stools, 4 human beings, invitation to sit around the table and pluck, 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 only Friday, Saturday, Sunday. No snacks allowed. If taugeh conversationalists are hungry, they may eat the taugeh raw. Sitter may sing them songs or supply head massages. Just think of how poetic this is and how much poetry it might lend to our national collection, and how interesting it would be for future curators to encounter this as they think of reactivating this work. Moving on, the museum can acquire a score for audiences to perform a creative act that speaks to the intention of the artist in the original work. The score can be similar to instructions that the artist gave to participants or collaborators of the work. Artist Han Xuemei notes that, or asks, in determining what to acquire, you have to first identify the intention of the artwork. How can we collect that? And how can there be space for a future audience to interpret whatever is being collected? Next, the museum can acquire a set of instructions for themselves to perform as a way of reflecting on and challenging the museum's relationship with artists, social forms of art, and traditional modes of collection. The acquisition is hence not entirely based on monetary systems of value, the museum's monetary power, or the artist's ability and desire to price their work. For example, in the case of Post Museum's really free market, the museum can be instructed to host editions regularly as a way of bringing alternative practices and people into its space, as well as providing a service to the public. Or in the case of Alicia Neo's Between Earth and Sky, and another version of this method is for the acquisition fee to go directly to an entity relevant to the work. So in Alicia's project, a work on caregiving, part of the acquisition fee could actually go to the Caregivers Alliance. There are infinite exciting possibilities with this, and we shall explore some later with our acquisition proposal. Finally, the museum could do something in between or a combination of the above, leaving room for the impossibility of collecting social forms of art and the nuanced imagination it requires. I quote artist Xi Jie, who asks, how can you document essence or human touch? How can you collect emotion or something magical? I also want to note that on the VIP night of Art Week just a few nights ago, I had a conversation with a big-time private collector who shall remain anonymous. He told me that artists in Singapore are perhaps living in a fantasy world where they are expected to be financially reimbursed for their work entering collections, where they expect, rather, to be financially reimbursed for their work entering collections, which he has observed is less the case in the Anglo world. What do you think of what he said? I shall say no more. And now, an interlude. Commentary by Shayus Sharif, The PMC Acquires Art.
The term professional managerial class was conceptualized by Barbara and John Ehrenreich in 1977. The term is defined by them as such: a class consisting of salaried mental workers who do not own the means of production, and whose major function in the social division of labor may be described broadly as the reproduction of capitalist culture and capitalist class relations. These workers may be directly and explicitly concerned with social control or with the production and propagation of ideology, as in the work of teachers, social workers, psychologists, entertainers, writers of advertising copy and TV scripts, etc. Their roles may also be more concealed and covert, though just as managerial, as in the work of administrators, managers, engineers, technical experts. The Ehrenreichs are not the first to conceive of such a term, though. Terms like the new class have been around since the 1970s, broadly referring to middle-class professionals who possess some form of higher education, higher than average income levels, and proximity to capital, though just shy of ownership. I'm skipping the historicization of the PMC hypothesis itself, but what seems noteworthy is that the PMC has seen some sort of lexical resurgence of sorts lurk around any befuddling and honestly disgusting internet subcultural spaces today, and you see rife discussions often hurling PMC as some sort of pseudo-slur. Catherine Liu, who penned the polemical Virtue Hoarders, the case against the professional managerial class, levels a scathing view of the PMCs as a credential class, the heroes who self-identify as possessing qualities like grit, resilience, self-discipline, control, and insight, while also championing the working class on the basis of solutionism and expert opinion. At the same time, Liu conceives of the PMC as embodying solutionism with a specific style of technocratic paternalism and an undercurrent of disdain and contempt. She argues for a dismantling of the PMC, or at least the PMC's penchant for virtue and moral accumulation. Others within the PMC discourse seem to be a little bit more optimistic. Gabriel Winnan, in an article for N+1, argues that for all the misgivings of the PMC, they stand as a natural outcome of the economic order of the day. He argues for a reclamation and a rehabilitation of the PMC and PMC values for a realignment with the working class. Now, I quote Catherine Liu, who mentions, young people wanting to enter what the Aaron writes called the liberal professions and gain positions in academia, culture, media industries have had to adapt themselves to the Procrustean bed of PMC-dominated networks of influence. Now, I'll probably get into some trouble here, but we can safely admit to ourselves that most of us in this room are PMCs, right? Even artists, Artists aiming towards having their works collected or acquired could possibly gain social capital, artistic legibility, credibility, and recognition. The artists who are deemed to have made it are ambivalent or struggling PMCs themselves. So, instead of virtue hoarding, the logics of economic survival necessitates that one hoards prestige instead.
Now, we move along to our case study of today on safe spaces and accountability, featuring Ila's work, There Can Be No Touching Here. A brief context. Over the years, there have been various incidents of predatory behaviors and or lack of transparency in the arts, resulting in unsafe conditions for arts workers, students, and audiences. One of these happened at Backstage, a joint exhibition between Coda Culture and Your Mother Gallery, which was organized when ArtStage Singapore 2019 was cancelled. A failure to transparently discuss the inclusion of a convicted sexual predator in the show resulted in a major conflict between exhibited artists and organizers. Because of recurring situations such as these, Ila is interested in what support from institutions looks like, as opposed to complicity and the further perpetuation of the status quo. She has been advocating for safe environments for arts workers, participants, and audiences with transparency, accountability, and a critical examination of the politics of care. Her program at the substation's Concerned Citizens program used different engagement strategies to further this. And then in 2019, she presented There Can Be No Touching Here at the National Gallery, Singapore. It consisted of 3 banners and a metal plaque. The work looks at the media's problematic language and how that language can perpetuate harm and reframes what support can look like with alternative models. It focuses on public activation, asking specifically for slow and thoughtful responses as a form of support and resource sharing. The audience or the public were free to contribute questions, thoughts on an interactive mind map. The physical components of the work were acquired by Singapore Art Museum in August of last year. But how to acquire the process of reactivation and the interactive mind map? Suggestions put forth by ELA included having a working site online to act as a resource collection point and a sharing station, as well as a set of instructions to represent the archive in future. As discussions continued, she formed the Body Archive Continuum, which is not just about sexual assault, but how to activate arts communities and institutions to have difficult conversations on gender, race, best practices, labor, and production, etc. Now, we're going to look at the challenges faced in the museum acquiring this work, as conversations have continued, but the acquisition of the archive has not yet happened. It is of my understanding that some acquisition discussions, even between other institutions, artists, or private collectors, can take years, even up to 10 years or more. This is what I've heard anecdotally. So, one of the challenges faced in this work in particular is authorship. Who owns the work, as ELA would eventually like to give up authorship? Whoever takes over the work, will they have the same considered position in activating the work? And how can we ensure that the work is carried out with care? And is training required for this new archivist who reactivates the work, given the sensitive nature of the work itself? Format. What will be a feasible and user-friendly platform? How do we ensure it's not abused by the public? How do we regulate and moderate it? Time. What is the kind of resource available to commit for a long time on the part of the museum? What is the frequency and relevance of activation when we choose to activate this archive? Jun Yap, Director of Curatorial Collections and Programs at SAM, says, the museum is trying to conquer time through instituting particular processes of collection and preservation. Collecting as a concept makes sense at a community and cultural level where it is believed that time can or should be handled in a certain way. A person who takes years to carve a form out of a rock doesn't necessarily think about how long it takes. Perhaps it would be interesting when you talk to artists to ask them what they think of time. Thank you, June. So what does it mean to preserve? Eugene Tan, Director of SAM and NGS, says, serving as a record of what we think is important art as a particular point in time, collecting ushers in a preservation process which kills off the artwork. Interesting. If we go back to the acquisition map, can we then say that the moment of collection is the moment when the artwork dies? What do you think? Li Xie, co-creator of The Lesson, which is a participatory experience where audience members discuss the role and responsibility of individuals living within a model of democracy. She says, in response for my invitation for The Lesson to be proposed for collection, I don't think you can exhibit change. What represents the lesson most precisely is how the audience changes within 2 or 3 hours. If you present only a moment, it is dead. The lesson remains an impossible project on how to collect a collective consensus. Finally, the final challenge of collecting ELA's work, will it live in the collection or in the archive? Is this archival material or artwork or both? How will the already acquired physical work be presented in the future without the activation component? Eugene Tan says, a collection and archive are related, but also very different. The archive is more about research, production of knowledge, and future possibilities. I think we need a new category sitting somewhere between archive and collections for social forms of art to be collected, documented, continue to live without seeing the process as a spectacle. So what is the larger responsibility of museums, of the Singapore Art Museum, or museums to its artists and public? How can we turn towards context surrounding the making of work and legitimize that as part of the work? Or put another way, if we believe in work being made in safe spaces, could this contextual groundwork be legitimized as art itself? Let's do a SWOT analysis of ELA's work to decide whether the museum should indeed collect it or not. Strengths. Wait, some of these were identified through conversation with Kenji and Ila. Thank you. Strengths. Relevant subject matter given recent happenings. Already rich in its development, many conversations. Very rich content. Weaknesses. It is a completely new process that involves a lot of resources. And does the funding line actually go there? Kenji notes that community arts, for example, has its own line of funding, but are there expectations on what kind of art the museum supports or makes? The commitment to resources over time. And also the difficulty of finding someone who can take over. Opportunities. There is a great opportunity for the museum to engage in a process of collecting a sensitive work that demands to live with a willing artist. I believe that this can help the museum develop its collection and curatorial practices. There is also an opportunity to invest in long-term infrastructure, developing curators who have a more public-facing practice. The multiplier effect of investing in social practices is also present and which might initially be invisibilized. Finally, threats. If it's not done right, sensitive information in the archive might be misused. We might also rile up detractors who don't see this living archive as artwork, but poo-poo to them. So, it's time for our next vote. Is Singapore Art Museum the right place to house this living archive at the moment? There is no right or wrong answer. This is more about taking a temperature of the room than anything else. Your only options are yes or no. You are forced to make a choice. So, I will say the options and Shah will count the votes. Is Sam the right place to house this living archive at the moment? If your answer is yes, raise your hand. Okay. No. We have 2. Okay. Thank you to the 19 people who voted. The consensus, or not consensus, but the winning vote is yes. So, Kenji, Eugene, and June, please continue your painful discussions with Ila. We hope that in 3 years' time, the work will be collected. Now, we move on to our second PMC interlude. Shah, please.
A natural companion to the PMC is the audit culture, in which accounting principles, techniques, and logics inform how organizations and even institutions go about whatever they do. Audit culture is marked by a proliferated use of indicators, like smileys to evaluate janitorial work, measurements like key performance indexes, which kind of ruins my life to be honest, and rankings, being able to claim if an organization is a center for excellence. Wonderful. And as well, a fetishization of data, information, and insight with a default orientation towards marketization, financialization, and ultimately optimization. How sexy.
How can the museum optimize itself to create the best collection? How can we become a museum hub?
For all its demands for transparency and accountability, bear in mind that such demands are often made unidirectionally from positions of power and authority to order that the outputs and performance of those being audited are vetted and regulated. What follows from such rationalization is a disposition towards a subjectivity of calculation, responsibility, self-management, and self-regulation. Traits and characteristics to manage the self and manage others. Now, you might be skeptical of the term PMC as a class, as a demographic marker, or what have you. But what we think is more important to think about is how the varied constellations of credentialed, educated, and network groups deploy influence on what art gets made or has been made visibly along the nexus of criticality and creativity in relation to capital. I would argue that an extension of this is that the PMC possesses tremendous influence on what kinds of art gets acquired and how they get acquired, and the afterlives of art post-acquisition. If we are all PMCs by way of the creative class or people adjacent to the creative class, what are the ways in which we enact and perform rituals in our specific audit cultures in the arts?
Thank you, Shah. I'm so excited because now, the moment we've all been waiting for. Get ready your phones and your Instagram filters. A budget red carpet entrance for our distinguished guest of today. President's Young Talent 2018. Local established artists who might soon add great value to the Singapore Art Museum collection. Zarina Muhammad. Applause, please. Thank you. Zarina's entire practice is concerned with honoring spaces, land, spirits, and their stories. Context. To her, context is everything. Before installing in any space, she pays respect to other entities in the space with offerings. This is not new in the art world. It is practiced on film and theatre sets and has been practiced in the Bras Basah location of SAM, especially in the 8Q building. With her work, 9 Questions as Instructions to Construct Pragmatic Prayers for Peculiar Habitats, Zarina is formalizing this practice of care and awareness. I now invite her to read 9 questions from a document she has written that constitutes the work. But first, let us air kiss. Zarina, please.
Thank you. 9 guiding prompts when setting up and sharing space in a new place. 1. What is the name of the place you're standing on now? What does it mean? How did they come to possess their name? What other place names, topographical names, local non-Anglophone names might this site possess? Has this site's identity been violently reshaped when it was renamed at any point in history? 2, do you know the names of any surrounding trees that might be older than most buildings within this site? What is the color, taste, and smell of the soil in the surrounding area? 3, what is your relationship to the land you're standing on now? 4, can you say the names see, hear, smell, sense, all the migratory flows of bodies and beings who have resided, occupied, moved through, been displaced, rehomed, undocumented, celebrated, shamed, desired, feared, revered, rerouted, uprooted, forgotten, in this exact spot where you stand? 5, what stories of infrastructures overlaid on spirit paths, desire paths, spaces created by or intervened by footpaths, extractive movements, multiscalar temporalities, disembodied historical imprints does this site hold? Locate the main pillar of this building. 6, what stories on territory, terror, time, terranthropy, detritus, talismans, and threshold keepers does this site contain? What is the direction of the door? 7, how do your feet or your whole body feel when they are pressed to the ground of this site? Can you sense sound paths below the ground? Measure the length of the thresholds in the space. 8, think, sense, intuit the breath and multiple forms of intelligences that mark and shape the spaces we move through. Intelligences that have the indeterminable capacity to sense light, temperature, electricity, sound, resources, predators, pathogens, parasites. Intelligences that take up space in the crevices we may overlook or not notice. Intelligences from emergent worlds that eschew deterministic shapes of perception. Intelligences that pick up on volatile signals and teach us how to listen in the dark and see. What range of forms do they take? Names they might have, ways in which they might be embodied and instinctively, intuitively felt in this space you're in now. What elements do you recognize in the room? 9. Reflect on the intergenerational and culturally divergent, expansive belief systems pertaining to living, the afterlife, averting danger, hauntings, and surviving. What are some of your own personal imaginings and cultural adaptations of these traditions? What are some of your apotropaic tactics and strategies for thriving and surviving in these very strange and demanding times? What might you ritualistically or pragmatically do to help yourself and others feel safe, avert danger, cope with the micro and broader terrors of our everyday? What gift can you offer to this space? Please also note that this act of gifting is neither a prop or a cursory aestheticized performance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zarina. And with that, we hereby invite the Singapore Art Museum Acquisition Committee to consider acquiring this important work. We have prepared a sample acquisition contract for your ease of use. The acquisition contract asks for $8,000 as well as a series of further action from the museum. They are equally important non-monetary agreements, such as prior to installation of work in any new space and as a constant practice of attentive, intentional, imaginative, and responsible space occupying, answer the 9 questions that Zarina just read. Hire a medium to communicate with the space and take note of the needs and wishes of spatial entities. Come up with and execute strategies of coexistence and conduct self-initiated research into spirit entities, decolonial practices, spatial histories, and interspecies relation. I do wonder, what would happen to Zarina's objects if they were acquired? Would they die in that moment of collection? Or would they live to protect and bless our national collection? And so, present Singapore Art Museum Acquisition Committee members, do you agree to acquire Zarina Muhammad's 9 questions as instructions to construct pragmatic prayers for peculiar habitats? It's okay, we'll talk about that later on. No worries, we already have the sample contract, okay? And we're coming to a close soon, be patient. We are now going to have Shah read the final chapter of the PMC Acquires Art.
How would the PMC think of social forms of art? How is value operationalized, quantified, justified? Because in order for something to be acquired, there must be a sensing of value to capture, to preserve, and maybe even reanimate the perceived value. Now, one critique about PMC efforts at social change via social programs and other progressive efforts is that PMC incrementalism gives way to a defanged and transmuted set of objectives. These may manifest themselves as a set of never-ending list of program items, pending approval by yet another never-ending list of criteria and assessment rubrics by corporate empty speak to find synergies, to empower, to amplify, to align, to future-proof, for example, whatever that means. So, contestation, discourse, negotiation, and friction is thereby masked or removed altogether, and whatever ideological content is tranquilized, and any form of social discourse, much less change, is couched in the very comforting terms of program, corporate, strategic, or institutional change management. and is operationalized and implemented through tedious administrative tasks and technical matters to be dealt with by, again, the experts. In light of this, how can the clauses and the terms agreed upon by the artists and the museums during the acquisition of social forms of art be crafted and negotiated in a way that is faithful to the intentions of the art itself? Just a question to think about.
Thank you, Shah. On that note, artist Han Xuemei asks, how can we make sure that the act of collecting doesn't reproduce values that the artwork is against? Eugene Tan notes, we have to change the notion of what collecting means, not just for us, but in the wider collecting community. Right now, it's very much about the market and monetary value. Now, for this final section, I invite you to close your eyes in this section of interweaving meditative voices as we consider some pertinent reflections. As has been the case for the entire lecture today, let me be the conduit through which flows a dialogue from various parties. Meditate on this conversation while enjoying Tchaikovsky. J. Ko and Chu Chuyuan said, sometimes participation can itself become spectacle rather than a strategy for engagement or empowerment. It may be possible to redefine a notion of artistic integrity when working with issues that affect a wide segment of society by also incorporating a process of ethical engagement with co-participants of a work or with affected communities. In this way, social responsibility can be practiced and is not always opposed to artistic integrity. We believe that engaged art is partly a critique and an extension of avant-garde art, dealing with another space, where we have to rethink our methodology and concepts and have to use different criteria in the production. SAM curator Kenji says, curatorial teams sometimes would prefer things that are extremely challenging or alienating, because difficulty is almost presumed to be good in its own right. Whereas the critique of educators and programmers who engage in social practices is that the practices they support are too easily digestible or simple. From my understanding, it feels that how social practice is justified in the eyes of curators issues from a lineage of performance and of post-conceptualism. So social practice becomes couched as an offering that is pushing the curatorial narrative forward beyond object-based practices towards post-media or whatever term of the day you want to use. So there are challenges that come with that, still having to justify such practices in terms of their art historical and aesthetic value. National museums like SAM are by the design of their bureaucratic procedures conservative, in the sense that they are big and slow ships to turn. The collecting museum presents a particular set of headaches for social practice artists to engage with. For them, is the museum actually the entity that needs to give validation to their projects? People who could become a strong public champion for such practices may, in fact, exist elsewhere. It feels like many contemporary artists are also expected to be curators in some way. And so it seems that the role of the curator then isn't so much to be the additional authorial voice, but to play more of a mediating function and to play the part of a conversation partner. When it comes to the institutional art world, I think the fewer curators there are, the better. There should be all kinds of other agents who feel that they can also have ownership in bringing artistic projects to life. June Yap says, because the presence of the museum or its perspective can change and affect whatever is happening. Eugene Tan adds, it is a bit contrived to come to a museum and see a social artwork happening. What makes it a work of art as opposed to something being done by social workers, who might be working in creative ways but don't have the kind of mindset to call it a work of art? In the same way, why do artists who work in such ways have to show in museums and present the work as exhibitions, projects, or programs? You may now gently open your eyes I hope that was an interesting meditation. And now, we go to our final vote. Should social forms of art bother entering the museum? Perhaps we might ask ourselves, who are museum audiences? Are they mostly Singaporeans who want to come to the museum on National Day because there's free admission to Singaporeans? Are we ultimately a group of PMCs in the room, just voting for the content these people will enjoy? Whatever it is, it's time to cast your vote. As always, you only have yes and no as your options. So, cast your vote wisely. Should social forms of art bother entering the museum? For yes, raise your hand. So dismal. Okay, 6. Okay. No, raise your hand. Ooh. Well, clearly the winner is no. Poo, poo, poo. Very sad. However, we will forge ahead with a bonus ending. We invite the Singapore Art Museum Acquisition Committee to collect this project. Yes, you heard right. Collecting this project is conceptually akin to collecting all social forms of art in Singapore. It's not just a convenient catch-all. It will show your criticality and progressiveness as the contemporary arts hub in Southeast Asia. Don't worry, even though it will have to be one of those troublesome living archive type of things like Ila's work, we won't make it too hard for you. For starters, we are going to get the relics ready right now so as to make the acquisition process smoother. The box is going around to collect relics from today. Please keep your courage medallion that is for you to keep and remember us fondly by. You may donate anything else, a scrap of paper, strand of hair, a booger, whatever you might want to collect, contribute some relics, skin cells, anything at all. So, Shah will let the box be passed around. You may pass the box around by yourselves, and we will close up our lecture for today. So, thank you very much for being here today at our lecture with so much love from the Singapore Art Museum Acquisition Subcommittee Advisory Task Force Coalition. And now, it's time for your questions as the box goes around. And once the relics are finished, we shall seal it up and pass it to Eugene Tan. Eugene, I will arrange a follow-up with your PA, Doreen, to discuss this acquisition. Thank you. Any questions from the audience? Anyone? Are you satisfied with our findings? Do you still want to be an artist? Okay, no questions? Thank you very much. Please feel free to approach us after this if you would like to chat further, and do check out the Dear Singapore Museum Acquisition Committee wall over there in that corner where I've mapped out some of these thoughts, as well as the questions on the wall towards the right of the gallery. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you to everyone for joining us at SAW Dialogues 2022 today. If you would like to find out about all the talks at SAW Dialogues 2022, please scan the QR code on the screen now. All recordings of the past panels are also available for viewing on SAW Digital. Do also look out for the summaries of each panel that will be released on artandmarket.net, where we share key takeaways from each talk for SAW Dialogues. Before you go, Do help us complete a survey to improve the program for the next Singapore Art Week. When you have completed the survey, take a screenshot of the submission page and show it at the info booths at Block 47 and Block 9 at Gilman Barracks to collect complimentary SAW 2022 merchandise. SAW Dialogues 2022 is presented by Art and Market in partnership with National Arts Council Singapore. See you at the next talk.